There's a surprise contender in the Premier League this season, and that is, of course, Nottingham Forest, who currently sit third, far outpacing expectations so far. So today, I'm joined by Jon Mackenzie, JJ Bull, and Nick Miller in order to ask the question, how good are they actually? Okay, JJ, let's begin with you. Tell me, what on earth is happening here?
Well, Nottingham Forest are third, like you said a minute ago. Last season they finished 17th, which is an improvement, as you'll have noticed. And they've done this by having the joint second best defensive record, as in conceding no goals. They're really good at not conceding goals. And they've also done this by not only having the lowest possession of any team in the Premier League, they've got the second lowest possession of any team in the top 5 leagues in Europe. That's not a lot of possession. It's a slight overperformance, or maybe a big one, depending how you look at it. They have the third best expected goals against in the league, so their defence is really solid, but they're overperforming it. But they're also overperforming on their expected goals, and this is a problem because they don't have very many of them. In fact, they have the 6th lowest expected goals in the Premier League this season. The big picture is that they should probably be about 9th. However, they have the joint 4th top goal scorer in the league in Chris Wood, playing very well. They have the highest direct speed of any team in the Premier League. They've got a very defined style, and they're very good at set pieces, much better than last season. For example, they have the joint 4th most goals from set pieces scored this season versus last season when they had the 4th lowest amount of goals from set pieces. That's an improvement.
What a turnaround.
Oh,
huh?
yes.
Good Lord.
Only 3 teams have conceded fewer set piece goals this season than Nottingham Forest versus last season when they conceded the most set piece goals. So they conceded 22 goals from set pieces last season, only 3 this season. That's a big improvement.
Sort of unbelievable.
And to sum it all up, what we know about Nottingham Forest is they're very, very efficient. And this little graph from The Athletic shows us that they are in fact the most efficient team in the league this season when you do Premier League points per game this season compared to expected points per game based on wage bill, which I don't fully understand, but the graph looks good.
It does look good, JJ. Thanks. Well, Jon, that's a comprehensive way of saying it is working. But what is it and why is it working, in your opinion?
Well, we need to talk about counter-attacking football, Joe, because that is what Forest are doing so well. Now, often when people talk about counter-attacking football, I think they use it quite pejoratively because a lot of teams that aren't very good often try and play counter-attacking football. You almost have to, right, if you're not going to possess the ball.
As an insult, Jon.
As an insult,
I
yes.
must translate you, you know.
Oh, yes, sorry. Let's talk a little bit about the logics of counter-attacking football, the reason why teams do what they do, because there's a couple of ideas here that I think are generally widely agreed to be the best way of playing football if you're not an elite side. The first principle is if you're defending, you want to try and make space as small as possible. So if you're a team who aren't going to be able to have a lot of possession, then it makes sense for you to, fall back into a block, not give up too much space around your goal and make it harder for your opponents to break you down. But this also plays into another principle, which is actually when you're attacking, if you can make space, as much space as possible, then it's going to be easier for you. So naturally, by dropping into a deeper block, you're going to be creating a lot of space to then attack. This is the basic principles of counter-attacking football. You defend well, and then you should, in theory, be able to create the scenarios for you to attack really well as well. There's a couple of problems here. The first one is that if you don't have much possession, the opposition has more possession because it's a zero-sum game. The less of the ball you have, the more they have. And that means that often in the Premier League, if you're defending super deep, you're just creating the conditions for your opponents to slowly grind you down and create, lots and lots of, slightly smaller chances, but with the quality that is on display in the Premier League, you will expect those teams to score. Yeah. So you can't defend too deep, because if you do that, then you're just allowing the opponents to score. The other aspect of this that's problematic is that if you're defending too deep, you then have much further to travel to get to the goal. So even if you're winning the ball back deep and then going long, it's going to be much harder for you to actually create or get the benefit of being able to attack these large spaces.
Just because of how long it takes you to get to the other goal.
That's right, yeah. And the few players that you have in the opposition's half, right? So you can't get the ball forward, hold it up and bring other players into the game. So I think what really good counter-attacking teams are able to do is get that balance right between defending with the right amount of players, but not so many that they then aren't able to make the most of the space that they are then afforded. And I think that's one of the things that Forest have done really well this season. This is a viz from this season of the chances that Forest have created, the areas that they're creating those chances from. And as you can see, the greatest number of chances are coming through this central space just in front of the penalty area that the nerds call zone 14. And it's obviously like a difficult area to create from. It's a congested area if you're playing more possession-based football. But as you can see, Forest are able to generate chances through there.
It's good that they've done it, Nick.
Yeah, this is a good thing.
Lots means good.
Yeah, it's good, yeah.
I've just got one sequence to give an example of how this looks, about how Forest are getting the balance between defence and attack right, and then creating through these central areas. So this is the goal that Forest scored against Spurs earlier this season. What we've got here is Forest are attacking from left to right here, but actually what's happened is they've just turned the ball over. They've just lost the ball, and a Spurs player here has picked it up. Let's just have a look at the structure that Forest are in. So we've got their back four here. They've got a double pivot of two midfielders. It's Ryan Yates and Elliot Anderson. We've got Morgan Gibbs-White, who usually plays in the 10 slot. He's just dropped out wide, but he'll try and get back into this area. And then you've got the front three trying to stretch the Spurs back line. Now, in the event of a turnover, you might expect a team like Forest to just immediately want to drop into a really deep, solid, stodgy, low block. But that's not actually what happens, because Spurs are able to move the ball back across the pitch. The ball is over here, that's why I put an arrow there. And already we can see here, Forest, yes, they've got their back line in place. Let's just throw the structure on actually. There's their back line. The two midfielders are here. You can see Elliot Anderson's tracking the run into the seam. But on the line of the ball, we can see Forest still have four players in front of the ball here. So they're not immediately dropping into a really deep low block. They're still giving themselves the access to those forward areas. So this isn't a really aggressive block at all. The Spurs players are able to move the ball into the centre of the field. And again, just look how passive this block is in many respects. They're not going after the ball. They're just sitting in their defensive structure. They've still got three players ahead of the ball. Callum Hudson-Odoi has dropped in to track Jed Spence's run. And actually, the ball is played to Spence. And that's the first moment. This is 20 seconds after the first screenshot I showed. That's when the first pressure actually comes in. Nico Williams steps up on Jed Spence. But the really interesting thing for me here is that this is where the pressure is taking place. We've got 5 Forest players here ahead of the ball, and we've got 2 actually quite nicely positioned to actually benefit from whatever happens in this tackle here.
Which is not what you really expect from like low block counter football,
Yeah,
is it?
I mean, I wouldn't call this low block counter, and I wouldn't even necessarily call it mid block and counter. I'd call it like a very sort of passive block, which is designed to, you know, turn the ball over into favourable situations, which is exactly what we get here, because the ball comes out straight to Ryan Yates. Yates is able to bait the Spurs player in, which then leaves us pass open to Morgan Gibbs-White here. And what we've got now is just the perfect conditions for a counter-attack. You've got your 2 wide players in the channels running at fullbacks or centre midfielder here. You've got Gibbs-White with just lots of space to progress the ball into, and then you've got Chris Wood occupying the 2 centre-backs here. And what ends up happening is that Gibbs-White is just able to move the ball down the field unpressured, and we've got this situation where we've gone from, you know, a scenario which looked very favourable to Spurs, turning into 4 Forest players running against the 4 backline players for Spurs. So a really, really efficient way of turning what looked like a pretty passive situation into a very, very active situation for Forest. And actually then, because of the dangerous scenario that they're in, Gibbs-White can play that ball in between the centre-back and the full-back to Anthony Elanga, who scores. But I think what's really interesting here is if we actually throw the structure back onto the pitch, here's our back 4 and our double pivot. They've not even made it into the Spurs half by the time that the goal is scored. There's only 4 Forest players here in that attack, up against, you know, 6, 7 Spurs players here. That's what we're talking about. They've got the balance right between getting the defensive capability to the maximum, but also being able to attack with very few players and still be efficient. And I think that's why Forest have been so dangerous this season, because even in this situation, if you lose the ball, you've still got your defensive base. Okay, it's going to be easy for the opponent to progress the ball down the field, but what they're able to do is still retain that defensive base, attack with very few players, but those players are super efficient. You're creating the perfect conditions for them to attack in, and we're seeing the benefits of that for Forest this season.
Okay. I mean, JJ, roughly once a season, there's a team that do extremely well that aren't perhaps expected to. And then sometimes you see that team struggle a bit more in the second half of the season, or indeed the following season, when opposition teams have worked out how to best play against them. Is that a concern for you with Nottingham Forest this season? Do you think as we move towards the end of the league, we're going to start to see opposition treat them differently, play against them differently?
Yes.
Great stuff.
But I can tell you why I think that.
Oh, okay.
So if Forest, if your opponent is going to say enemy, but if your opponent is not your enemy, I guess technically. Yeah. If your opponent is best without the ball, then in theory, why don't you just give them the ball, right? Because that's what they're going to do. They're going to try and, exactly what John's saying, they're going to try and get you into a certain situation so they can pounce on you and trap like a spring. And one of the things that I think is really cool about them is that it reminds me of rugby a little bit, is that they wait for the team to be opened up so that they can pounce. And like Yates or Anderson, they won't pounce on them until they can, and then you can generate momentum. Because once you can generate the momentum, suddenly you get all these players. You get Elanga, Hudson-Odoi, Gibson-White. They're all really fast and they charge forward, and it always ends up with Wood being the one who's behind them. So they get forward really quickly. These guys get in amongst it. Wood ends up arriving just on time to try and score a goal with them.
Elanga's so fast he had 2 arrows.
He is actually probably the fastest one. So
Really?
I did that on purpose.
He's the fastest one, Nick. You got it, yeah?
Yeah, he's fast. Yeah.
I'm just making sure that you're...
And that was because of the arrows.
That's the 2 arrows.
The more arrows I do, the faster the player is.
Yeah.
I remember that, everyone. So if you want to then make sure that they can't do this, you want to make sure you don't give them the ball in that way. So you don't want to open up and make the pitch nice and wide, because if you do, they're going to go straight through the middle of you. There's a couple of things that I've seen some teams do. Newcastle and Liverpool are the 2 examples I can think of at the moment, try and stop them do this. So if you want to play out from the back, the goalkeeper out to these centre-backs, what you'll notice is that Forest don't really, like they press high sometimes, but only with like this front 3, or it's normally like Morgan Gibbs-White. They keep the rest behind the ball, like John's saying. So they'll chase the ball backwards. Like the trigger or the training they'll do is that when the ball goes backwards, that's when they'll chase it to try and force the goalkeeper to go long, because then they can win it back in the middle of the pitch. But if they don't do that, what then happens is they instantly just drop off, and the line of engagement is basically round about halfway. You'll see this sort of shape quite a lot, where they're quite compact like this. But you'll have Wood and Gibbs-White in the middle here, and they're just waiting. Wood's going to try and make sure the ball doesn't go across. Wood will try and stand in between the 2 centre-backs, so they have to go one way, and then eventually they'll lead them to one side of the pitch. They'll pounce on them, they'll go forward with momentum. So don't do this. This is what teams don't need to do. Newcastle didn't really do this. What they did when they were playing against them, and I think they beat them, was it 3-1, wasn't it?
3-1.
3-1, yeah. There we go, I know what I'm talking about. So they pushed players forward, but they would pass out like this, pass from side to side. You want to try and like work it, get here, go backwards, try and move them around, just open up a little bit of space. But then when they went forward, they go for a big switch pass, they'd shove all the players they've got into a small area of the pitch. So when the ball is launched over here, this is not exactly how it would look, it could be more separate really. But the ball would bounce loose, they've got players who can counter on it to jump onto it, but they still have players behind the ball to deal with the on-rushing momentum from this team. The other thing as well is if you do get into these positions, because you can go through Forest if you're playing well, like Liverpool did, I think, for a lot of the game they just played against them. When you get to, as John's saying, zone 14, so this sort of bit here, let's draw it. It's actually specifically like here, isn't it? Let's see more like this. That's probably zone 14, John?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, pretty good. So when you get here, rather than, like, because you're normally in front of a block, because what they tend to do when they drop into the really deep block, because one of the wide players will come back and track maybe most of the fullback. So they get like a 5, even Wood will drop in, so you get like often like a 5-4 or 5-5-0 or something like that, 5-4-1, something like that. But you're blocked basically, so there's not much space. So how do you create an opportunity? Just shoot, just have a shot. And you saw Liverpool do it quite a lot. And maybe you'll see teams doing this. If you're good from shooting from long range, you might have a little opportunity, take a shot, the goalkeeper might spill it. That's one opportunity that then you can get someone to run in. But when you keep shooting, it of course means that the opposition has to react, because if they're waiting for you to shoot, because it's a low XG chance, you don't really care if a team's doing that, you probably have to start reacting to it. So the player might jump out to try and go close to them, which might mean this guy can sneak in, so you sneak something through, it comes off the goalkeeper. Just something to make an action happen. You need to break the game basically. If it's blocked down, you need to open it up. And that's maybe one way you can try and do that. And some teams might try things like this against Forest going forwards. But loads of teams have this problem in the second half of the season when they've played them against them once. Then you take them seriously. Maybe even like what happened to Wolves when Nuno was there. They did really well one season, and suddenly you can't quite do the same things because people sit off you more.
Yeah.
So that's probably what we'll see.
Are you worried about people sitting off you, Nick?
Me specifically, or the Nottingham Forest?
Yeah, both.
Well, less about me, more a little bit about Nottingham Forest.
Yeah,
we are getting to the point in the season now where teams are, we're kind of going the reverse fixtures. Teams are playing Forest for the second time. Obviously, the surprise factor, if you want to call it that, is not so much of a thing. So there is that kind of worry. In terms of the kind of general fan sentiment, people are just kind of enjoying it while it's still there. I think one thing might be that maybe sort of encouraging is that Forest don't really get many injuries. There have been 2 big injuries so far this season. They both happened in the first couple of weeks of the season. Danilo broke his leg. Ibrahim Zagara has been out for a long time with a hamstring injury. Other than that, most of the first team have been fit for most of the time. A couple of games here and there. I think Hudson-Odoi missed one. Gibbs-White missed 1 or 2. Murillo missed 1. But beyond that, the Nuno's basically had the whole team to kind of choose from.
I think second best injury record this season is to West Ham, right?
And I think that it's always very difficult to kind of ascribe this to one thing in particular, but it might be to do with the fact that they don't run very much. That is one kind of way that it might be sustainable for the rest of the season. But yeah, it will be interesting to see if Nuno reacts to the other managers reacting by changing the style slightly, possibly with the Wolves example in mind. Probably won't do that this season, but next season it will be very interesting to see how that changes things.
Yeah, I mean, John, Nick's talking about that longer-term sustainability. What's your perspective on it?
Well, I think we need to remember that the context here is very different from what it was 6 months ago. The beginning of the season, Forest, the big question is, are they going to stay in the league? On the basis of last season, they finished just outside the relegation spots. 6 months on, they're now in a situation where we're asking, can they actually make the top four? So I think the question of sustainability is very different. Even if they don't win another game, they're probably in a good spot to survive relegation. So that's the caveat to talk about sustainability. But there are some things in here that I think do sort of invite some kind of discussion, one of which is that Chris Wood of Conundrum, which is Forest are very, very reliant on Chris Wood, which is, it's true for all teams, right? A lot of teams are reliant on their best players.
All teams are reliant on Chris Wood, that is.
That's right.
Yeah, I think so.
The other teams are not doing so well because they aren't using Chris Wood very well.
They haven't got Chris Wood.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, Chris Wood, very important to this system. I've just got the goals scored by Forest players this season in the league. As you can see, 13 goals from Chris Wood, and then a big drop down to Morgan Gibbs-White. So if anything happened to Chris Wood, I guess the question would be how well they would be able to sustain their...
You said that like a mafioso. If anything were to happen to Chris Wood.
Nice New Zealand centre forward you've got there. Shame if anything was to happen to him.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think it's also very easy for us to sort of point the finger at efficiency and say, this striker's doing really well. Chris Wood is doing really well. He's got 11 goals from just under 6 XG. That's a massive overperformance. And I think a lot of people just say, well, you can't expect him to keep playing at this level. But there are some things I think that suggest that the efficiency that he has is actually planned by Forest, and as a result, the chances are going to keep coming, and maybe he won't finish them as efficiently, but he'll still be a dangerous player for them for the rest of the season. So this is his shot map, and as you can see, a lot of the goals coming from just really efficient areas, right? The areas where you can create decent chances. The bigger the circle here, the bigger the chance, and you can see most of the big circles he's scoring. The other thing to notice is like shot efficiency, because he's only had 35 shots, which means that he is being very efficient. He's not like a high volume shooter. They're just getting him into the right areas. We talked about how Forest are trying to do that. And as a result of that, you can see his XG per shot, 0.17. So you're talking about 1 in 5 chances you would expect him to score. That's not even taking into account, I watched all of his shots this season, and he does take a lot of sort of silly shots as well as good shots. Obviously, sometimes that's going to be outside the box, whatever. We can talk about that long shooting all we like, but there's also a few in the box where he just sort of takes snapshots at chances that aren't really chances, and that's going to bring that value down. So I reckon that most of the time with Wood, when he gets a decent chance, you're talking like 1 in 4 likelihood of scoring, which is like that's the sort of efficiency that you want. The other thing to say about efficiency is that actually this season isn't really an outlier for Chris Wood. So I've got a list here of his shooting efficiency, like goals per shot ratio here, and you can see that his time at Forest, he's roughly been around the same level of efficiency. And interestingly enough, like this season, we're thinking about Chris Wood as like having some kind of hot streak, but his performances this season have been very similar to what they were last season. You can see he's just about 190 away from actually hitting however many minutes he got last season, and he's 1 goal away from that. So and his shooting efficiency is around the same level. So this isn't something that's just come out of nowhere. What this is that Chris Wood is clearly a striker who thrives well in that counter-attacking style of play. So there's that as well. And then one final thing on Wood that I think is kind of interesting is I showed you before the areas where Forest are creating their chances from, most of them coming from zone 14 that we've been talking about all of this episode. Actually, for Chris Wood, the passes are coming to him for his chances, actually much more likely to come from these wide half spaces in the forward areas. And I think that's because Wood is actually quite a different striker meta to what we're seeing a lot of in the Premier League. A lot of Premier League strikers now you want them to be quick, you want them to get in behind those back lines and score like that. Wood isn't really that kind of striker. There are a few chances you can see here where he is played in behind from zone 14, but a lot of these chances are more just the wide players coming in and creating cutbacks for him to then just tap in as well. So I think, again, there's a level of efficiency here. The way that Forest are playing, they're designed to get those wide forwards in behind and then set Wood up for chances in the box.
So it's interesting that Forest use him in quite a different way to, say, Burnley did, because I remember analysing a lot of the goals he scored for Burnley, and a lot of them were what you might expect. Crosses from wide into the box, he heads it in and he scores. Forest don't really do that very much, and he's quite an inventive finisher as well. If you look at all his goals for Forest, some of them are quite weird finishes. Like the goal he scored against Everton just recently, was a nice little lob. He scored a few kind of lobbed headers as well. There's one back header from across, I think it was against Crystal Palace last season.
The Man United goal as well was sort of like
the Man United goal
yeah.
was there was an element of luck to that one, but yeah, he's a more kind of inventive finisher than you might think.
His movement is incredible as
Yeah.
well. I think that's worth saying. Like so many of the chances where he's tapping it in is because he's running into the box, changes his direction, finds the space at the right time. Really good at that. And when you have those players going in behind and you're looking for cutbacks, he's just the perfect striker for that.
Well, Chris Wood sure is important, isn't he? But Christ, Nick, you must worry. What if they were to lose him, huh?
Yeah, any suggestions for any kind of potential replacements?
Me?
Yes.
Not me. But Alex Barker has one, and he's about to tell it to you, not me.
Chris Wood is having an incredible season, but Nottingham Forest might still need to sign another striker. After all, Wood is 33, and Forest don't have another target man in their squad. A potential problem, given how important he is to their setup. The club has recognised this too, and are actively exploring options in the market. Likely searching for someone young with the potential to replace Wood in the long term, while maintaining their newfound status as a European football contender. With that in mind, I think a sensible transfer would be Tierno Barry, a French striker who recently joined Villarreal. Not only does he profile closely to Wood, but he's also being used in a similar way, with Villarreal pumping balls forward to him to start attacks. And Barry actually looks stronger than Wood in some areas, like in the air, where his stature allows him to consistently dominate, and mobility, with Barry more capable of spinning his marker and quickly carrying the ball forward. One area he could improve though is goal scoring, because despite having a respectable record, Barry sometimes wastes chances by prioritising power over accuracy and taking shots from difficult positions. But I still believe he's a sensible transfer, because Barry often makes up for this by creating chances for others, either by laying it off or playing accurate through balls. In fact, he currently ranks as one of La Liga's most creative strikers. Of course, given his skill set and age profile, he wouldn't come cheap. But if Forest want to keep pushing for European football, then Barry is exactly the sort of player they should be signing.
There's a lot of players talked about right there, JJ, but there's another Forest player that you think is very important to the system.
Yes, there is one player. Nottingham Forest has signed a lot of players, and they've signed a few midfielders in their time who have made a real difference, but one has really stood out. And they didn't actually even sign him, he just came through the academy. And that is Ryan Yates. Now, he's not what you consider to be the most technically proficient player in the entire of Europe. Specifically Europe, I don't know why I said that, but that's what we've got.
I never thought he was.
No, and this is, well, it's relevant, right? Because you think if you're buying loads of players in for lots of money, you want really good technical proficient players. And you can see his FBref profile, it takes a lot of shots, but what you'll really notice is that his defensive numbers are very high because he has lots of interceptions and blocks and tackles, that sort of thing. Now, but let's compare Ryan Yates to Nicolas Dominguez, who is kind of like the upgrade, I think, in theory, of Ryan Yates. He has very similar sort of numbers, which just is slightly better on all the more technically relevant metrics, if you want to call that. But I think there's something about Ryan Yates we need to look at and why he's so important to Nottingham Forest, because they keep playing him. They keep playing him. He shouldn't really be in the team, but he keeps playing and has been there all the time. So this is Nottingham Forest playing against Olympiacos. Now, the ball is over here. Our hero is over here. That's where Ryan Yates will enter the scene. Now, as you'll observe, the ball is over on this left-hand side. Forest are the ones playing from left to right in the sort of dark blue tops. The ball goes in this direction, you follow the arrows, that's where the ball is going. But you'll notice that Nicolas Dominguez is being pounced on by two preying Olympiacos players. Danger awaits. And so what happens is they close in on him. Dominguez has to get out of this. This is bad, because what you'll see here is our heroes over here. But what's more relevant is this huge amount of space. Once this player runs into this space here, this is the space. So they're going to have a massive amount of space to run into if this ball turns over. This is a problem. Yates is quite far away from his midfield partner, but he's already reading where this is going to go. When this player moves in that space and plays that ball, he's already going, and he takes ball and man. Both are gone in this situation. From behind, slide tackle.
Yeah, and we can't play the video for obvious reasons, but if you could, you'd see everything just slide off all the way off the screen, right?
That's right, and then he catches fire, and an air raid siren goes off. But what you have here is that the game stops. The referee circled here has observed this particular moment and is coming over to make sure the other players are aware of it. Which then we cut to this scene of Ryan Yates turning round. Now, there are a couple of things I need to tell you about this particular scene and why I think it's relevant. First of all, this is in the first minute of the game. And this is a friendly. So what you get with Ryan Yates is a player who will give it his all, his passion, his tackling. What you see here is Ryan Yates sitting top of the Nottingham Forest table for fouls committed in the league. He plays quite a lot, so that gives him an advantage against certain other players, but that's many more fouls than other players. Perhaps it's a one-off. No, last season, here he is, top of the league in Nottingham Forest squad from much fewer 90 minutes. He's got 22 here compared to people below him with slightly more. But what's really interesting about this is if we go back to the original one here, if you look at all the players who have all the fouls, it's the central midfielders. So Dominguez, Anderson, Gibbs-white, Yates. Nottingham Forest are fouling in midfield. That's where they're committing their fouls, and Ryan Yates is the king of this. This is what he does. And interestingly about that, Nottingham Forest on this list of fouls committed per game are actually 4th lowest. So it's not that they're committing loads of fouls all the time. It's that when they get into midfield, Ryan Yates is there, and so you have to watch out for him. And it reminds me of this book called The Captain Class by Sam Walker, one of my favourite ever sports books. I recommend it thoroughly to you. Talks about how every team, every elite sport winning team has a captain or a water carrier. So it's not about having the best player, the best coach, or lots of other things like that, lots of variables. It's about having a water carrier player who does the hard work, and it's called a water carrier. It comes from Eric Cantona. I think he was kind of slagging off Didier Deschamps back in the day by describing him as that. Didier Deschamps, again, not the most technically proficient player, very good level player, but he was more of the ball winner and the guy who does things that other people don't. And one of the examples in the book is Richie McCaw of New Zealand. That's his name, isn't it?
I'll trust you on that one.
I thought you would know. It's Richie McCaw, isn't it?
He's a rugby player, yeah.
Yeah, so like a player who played with a ruptured testicle in a game, didn't realise it, but going that extreme length to like make sure the team wins is what you need, a player who will go the extra level. And Yates is kind of like that. He does not like lead by barking orders. He does organise people. I think you saw against Liverpool quite a lot. He's telling everyone to calm down. Murillo's constantly pumping the ball forward. He's telling everyone around him to calm down, like focus, do what you're told. But he also will do the work constantly up and down. And if your captain's doing it, everyone else around you does that. And if you have that sort of inspiration on the pitch, it can make everyone else around you better. So although he might not be the best player, the team is much better from having Ryan Yates in it.
Great stuff, JJ. Thanks very much. I love to hear about Ryan Yates, but I want now to hear about Evangelos Marinakis, Nick, who is Nottingham Forest's owner. What do you think his long-term vision for the team is?
Ever since he bought the club in 2017, when Forest were in the very depths of despair / the Championship, he always said, well, we can, get into Europe and play European football, which at the time everyone thought was ludicrous, but is actually happening now. He's, extremely, the kind word would be ambitious for Forest and all of his clubs, which is an expanding empire. Yeah. He originally owned Olympiacos and he bought Forest. He has subsequently taken over Rio Ave in Portugal, and we think he is currently in negotiations to buy Vasco da Gama in Brazil as well.
And he recently hired Edu as well, didn't he?
Yes, Edu, I don't think has officially started work, but he will be kind of the head of the Marinakis broader empire.
Right.
So he has always kind of had these desires for world domination, and Forest are very much part of that at the moment.
Okay, he recently wrote off quite a lot of debt, didn't he?
Yeah, he does this from time to time, but basically converts debt into shares, which is a kind of way of just inserting money into the club without breaking any rules. It will be interesting to see how the transfer policy, if Forest get into Europe, maybe not the transfer policy in this transfer window in January, but in the summer, whether they will go for kind of more high-profile players. The sort of sustainable plan will be to sell a few players, maybe Gibbs-white, maybe Murillo, for a lot of money, and then kind of it probably won't follow the kind of Brighton model of sell big name, expensive player, buy a collection of players you've never heard of, and make them better. Marinakis' mentality might mean that they will go for some more high-profile players, but I think the hope that from many kind of sensible Forest fans perhaps is that they do follow this Brighton model a little bit more, and they have kind of done that a fair bit. With that, they have bought a lot of players for very low amounts of money, and they kind of made them key parts of the system and increased their value. So yeah, it will be really interesting to see what happens next summer.
That is interesting. Thanks. I mean, you mentioned transfers there. JJ, let me come to you and ask you about Nottingham Forest's transfer strategy, because it's a big one, but it's changed a little bit.
Yes, so when they came up to the Premier League, they signed a lot of players. In fact, they signed 198 million euros worth.
Wow.
I'm using euros because it's transfer marked numbers, that's why I'm doing that. But they had to do that because their entire squad was made up of loan players and out of contracts, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, pretty much. There were 5 loan players. 4 of them were pretty kind of key players in the promotion team. Jed Spence.
Oh yeah, of
was one
course.
them.
Now at Spurs, yeah.
Now at Spurs. And they had a very sort of threadbare squad of permanent players when they got promoted. So they had to buy a lot of players. Maybe 29 was a little bit excessive, but they certainly did have to bulk up.
Yeah, and some of them didn't even play, I think, for the club once.
3 have yet to play.
Yeah.
One, Omar Richards, partly because he had a broken leg and that was missed in his medical.
It is hard to play if your leg is broken. But they did sign a lot of players, as you can probably see on the full screen graphic that isn't what I've got on my board. But there's lots and lots of players that they've signed. Some of them have played, some of them quite well. The following season, they didn't spend quite so much because they didn't have to. And then they made some money back from selling some players, which is very, very important to do.
Yeah.
So their overall balance or their overall net spend or loss was 44.8 million euros.
And we should say they still did buy 17 players.
Yeah,
it's a lot a season after you've just bought 30.
They bought lots of players next year. And they bought players like Sangari, Alanga, Wood, Murillo, Turner, Sells, Dominguez, like all players that have played for the club. So like they are looking for players that are going to make them better, and they're selling them as well. So Brennan Johnson, who was pretty important that season before, sold for 55 million to Spurs. So this is what they're doing. You know, when a bigger team or club comes for their best players, they kind of have to sell to sustain what they're doing because you can't do it otherwise. So that's what they were doing. But we come to the most recent season. They're still buying lots of players for lots of money, but their overall balance on their transfer record is pretty good, minus 18.8 million euros according to Transfermarkt. And the players they've signed are players like Elliot Anderson, who has completely fooled me, proved me wrong. Didn't think he'd be as good as he is. He's been absolutely fantastic so far. Milenkovic, great signing for Serie A, really tall centre-back. It's just, you can see the players they've got. They've brought in decent players. And my hot take is that they're looking for wonder kids, or players who were once wonder kids but didn't quite reach the level they thought they could get to.
Super kids.
Yeah, so if you're looking for super kids, yeah. So if you're looking for players who are going to take you to the next level, you want to find the very highest potential super wonder kids, and everyone knows who they are. Like when Kylian Mbappe comes through at Monaco, you know he's going to be a superstar. That's not Forest's supermarket. They're not shopping in Waitrose. They're shopping in
Tesco's.
Yeah, well, that's harsh on Tesco, I think.
No,
but
Tesco's is a premium
Below.
store, but it's a second. It's an everyday store.
I'll come up with a better shop at some point here, but I think the point is they're looking for players who basically have not fallen off, but they haven't reached the level you thought they could, and they're available for a really good value. Like Hudson-Odoi was linked with a £50 million move, something like that, to Bayern Munich back in the day, but they got him for about 2.5 million. They got him with some add-ons as well. And then like Nikola Milenkovic has been highly thought of, but not a top tier player for a long time, but you signed him for 12 million euros. And like Anthony Alanga, clearly good at Man United, but not quite ever going to be a first team player, so they can get him for about 17. So they're finding value in players who aren't the top tier, like Barcelona and Real Madrid. They're not looking for these players, but teams who are below that can get some value out of them. And you see improvements in players like Ola Aina, especially, a Chelsea youth player, really highly thought of, but never really considered to be, I think as far as I'm aware from my research, of being a top tier superstar, but has become a really solid, very good high-level player. You wouldn't take Aina and put him into, I don't know, say like Liverpool right now, for example, but he's performing at a level that would suggest he probably could. It's kind of odd. But basically their transfer dealings have been scouted in the right markets. It looked like they were signing loads of players and it looked a bit crazy, but it's worked out really well. And what you've now got, as per Scouted Football, really good people to follow on the internet, as per FPRF, only 6 players in Europe's Big 5 leagues have recorded 20 plus shots, 20 plus key passes, 20 plus take-ons completed, 20 plus aerial duels. And you've got 2 Nottingham Forest players in Morgan Gibbs-White and Elliot Anderson in there. So the players they've brought in are performing at a higher level because they're given the basis to do so. So all the transfers they're making are projected for the future to be successful. And they are getting there by smart coaching, good tactics, momentum in the team. Been pretty smart.
We should say that they have got a little hot water PSR-wise, Nick, right?
Yeah, so as those numbers in one of the first slides will show, lost a lot of money on those that first summer of transfers. They tried to get out of any punishment by using the come on defence, which was
I like it.
Yeah,
it's good.
It didn't quite work, but they sold Brennan Johnson. They sold him a little bit too late in terms of the kind of relatively arbitrary cut-off point for these rules. So that kind of meant that they were deducted 4 points last season. There's been a kind of gradual refinement of the transfer policy, which means that they won't get into those kind of problems again. Partly that was some kind of fairly opportunistic things with Elliot Anderson and selling a couple of players to Lyon for huge amounts of money, which has certainly helped them with PSR concerns as well. And so the hope is that they will be much more sustainable going forward and not do silly things like spend lots of money on 29 players again.
Okay, fine, interesting. Well, now let's hear from Phil Hay on something else just a little bit interesting.
Lazio's club badge famously features an eagle. To stay on brand, they have a real-life eagle that flies around their stadium and a falconer to look after it. Or they did until Sunday, when they announced that they had parted company with a falconer. The man in question, Wan Bernabe, had been for surgery on, a certain part of his body and posted pictures on social media of his new improved appendage. This aroused some anger at Lazio, who sacked him immediately and announced it in an official club statement. You think you've seen it all, but it's true what they say, you never have. That said, you'll find all this and more in the Athletic FC newsletter. You can sign up clicking on the link below.
All right, well, all that's left to do, thank you, Phil, good Lord, is to ask, if we think they're going to make Champions League or not, and to answer the question of the title of the show, which is, how good are they actually? Little snippy, little snappy. What do you think, John?
I think they're very good for what they do. Whether or not that's going to be good enough to get them top four is a big stretch for me. But it's been great watching them play that brand of football in such a commendable way.
Fantastic. What a vague answer. Nick?
I think Forest will finish in some kind of European places. That it could be fifth, which might be enough for the Champions League.
It is currently, as it stands.
Yeah, but I think there will be some form of European football next season, maybe not in the top four.
Okay. JJ?
They're going to do it, yes.
Yeah, great stuff. Okay, I think that's it. Bye.
If you like this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. The Athletic is home to some of the world's best sports journalists, including David Ornstein, Amy Lawrence and James Horncastle. With the latest transfer news and insights on every Premier League story that matters, theathletic.com puts you inside football, and you can try it for free now for 30 days. See the link in the description.